Hello, gang. Thanks again for joining and having an insightful discussion here today on the Ilities, where we talk about traceability, sustainability, supply chain visibility, and of course, product data transparency and circularity. Today is going to be a deeper discussion into circularity, in particular in the apparel space. And with me today is Pamela Fierst-Walsh. Pamela, why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and what you're doing these days?
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you. So, after 17 plus years as a diplomat, where I was most recently the senior advisor to the Kimberley process, as well as the senior advisor for conflict and critical minerals, I got really steeped into all sorts of supply chains and the national security issues behind those, as well as the business case for responsible sourcing. And then I was lulled away to the apparel space by a large company named PVH. And I was their VP of traceability for a while. And now I'm out on my own, running my own advisory, PFW Advisory, where I get to advise clients on all sorts of fun issues in the above spaces. So there you go.
Great. Thank you. Yes. And that's advisory space is a lot of fun. I know it well.
It is.
I know. So let's turn to apparel. And my first question for you is why is, apparel has been working in sustainability for a long time. There are certainly companies out there that are very leading in this area, particularly like Patagonia is, very well known in this, perhaps even Nike. But from the circular perspective, why is circularity important for the apparel sector?
Well, first, let's make sure we're clear about what circularity means for just about any topic, right? It's really like a 1-for-1. So what that means is you're taking a t-shirt and you're making it into another t-shirt or another shirt, right? So you've created like a closed loop around supplying. That's the idea of circularity. The reason it's important is because the apparel space has a massive environmental problem on its hands, particularly owing to fast fashion and consumption around fast fashion, but it's not just fast fashion. The fact is that there are tons and tons and tons of apparel, used or unused, piling up in landfills, piling up on the beaches of developing countries, clogging all sorts of receptacles and just contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a really big problem. That's why you hear more and more from the apparel industry about the importance of circularity or circular business models.
Okay. Interesting. So I know you are active and perhaps still on the board of Textile Exchange, and they've recently released one of their annual reports related to informing the industry in terms of where to focus and what's important. What can you talk to us about that? What does that mean for the folks out there?
Yeah. Happy to. So I'm very passionate about the work that I'm happy to get to do as part of the governance board of Textile Exchange. So full disclosure, I am on that board. I am active in that space and really passionate about it. So Textile Exchange is a leading nonprofit organization that sets the standards for a variety of sustainable materials. So if you want to certify yourself to, sustainable wool, it's Textile Exchange that has developed that standard, and then you are certified by a third party against that standard. So Textile Exchange's primary mission is to help the apparel industry toward a more solid and sustainable environmental set of practices. As an organization, we're working toward 45% reduction in greenhouse gases from the apparel supply chain. It's obviously a huge, huge task, but we are driving ourselves toward that by offering the tools and the standards and the vision that our members need. The report that you're referencing refers to a recent report they issued on the future of synthetics. So when we talk about synthetic materials, we think polyester, we think nylon, not cotton, right? Or leather, things that are naturally occurring. And so in the future of synthetics, they tackle the beast of circularity. Now, one of the reasons I neglected to mention this in the beginning, but one of the reasons that circularity is so important is because of the regulatory environment pushing towards circularity. Now, in the European Union, the EU, as part of its Green Deal, has established a vision for circularity where clothing, textiles in particular, has to be durable, recyclable, circular, and to a great extent made of recycled fibers. And there are also going to be some limits, we think, around the export of unused clothing to get at that kind of piling up in developing countries issue I was talking about. So circularity is a really big issue for a lot of the brands that are members of Textile Exchange. So in this report on the future of synthetics, there's a big section on circularity and why it's important. Yeah. So I'll leave it at that right now.
Okay.
Sorry, we can edit this out. Well, I kind of lost my track. Yeah.
No, we'll leave it at maybe, but it's fine.
Great. Thanks.
I guess, like, to drill down into something that you touched on with respect to Textile Exchange's objectives of a 45% reduction. So, like, tell us how is that measured? How do they report? How does the body of the exchange report on that, or is it really just an edict or an objective pushed out to industry and say, here's what you should shoot for? How does it come about, and how can someone really know, well, are we there? Are we getting there, or or not? Right.
So they're working on science-based targets, right? Like, that's what they're working off of. So they don't necessarily set the amount of carbon that has to be removed from the atmosphere. Like, that's way beyond an organization like Textile Exchange. But what they can do is offer the options and the best way to get to kind of preferred fibers or preferred ways of farming that release less carbon, ways of processing material that release less carbon, standards behind recycling, which is, believe it or not, very controversial. And so they offer these tools. I mean, really fantastic suites of information for brands and retailers to look at how they could minimize their footprint and contribute to that minimization of greenhouse gases. And so, that's kind of their big approach. I'll say that, it's lots of things in that subspace can get controversial very fast. I alluded to recycling. I think coming into the topic, I didn't appreciate the nuances behind recycling. I think as a consumer, I think, oh, well, it's difficult to recycle. And wouldn't it be great if I was using stuff that had, recycled material in it or was recycled? But the truth is that in the apparel space, their Textile Exchange advocates against the usage of, say, plastic bottles in those synthetics because, one, the feedstock is better placed with bottles, first of all, and two, it contributes to, they're not trying to create a dependency on plastic bottles. They're trying, because it doesn't do anything to actually limit the amount of virgin polyester used if they're just using bottles that have been made with virgin polymers. So what they're advocating is, again, with the circularity, you're not increasing the amount of virgin material used. You're just taking what's already there and you're reusing it and refashioning it into something consistently usable. The technology is not there. This is the big rub on circularity. But you're going to ask me about that, I suspect.
Yeah, and well, I think and it's been in the news lately too, with some fairly one or two high profile announcements coming out of entities that were set up specifically to try and repurpose materials through recycling, and the math just doesn't seem to be there as yet when we're in this take, make, dispose sort of reward cycle. This the take, make, and reuse, but you have to pay more for what you reuse Yeah, I think you probably have perspectives on that. I have a very supply chain focused, and where how the product moves one way and the money moves the other way. Look at that, and to me, the science just doesn't support what I would call, or the technology doesn't support. Take glass. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it's there's all talks about recycling glass because it's almost infinitely recyclable. But the problem we still have is that recycled glass is still more expensive than virgin glass.
Mm-hmm.
So until that tipping point uh, occurs where it's either equal or less expensive than virgin, you won't see, I think, grand benefits out of use of recycled glass. And that's just my particular perspective. So,
No, and I mean,
well,
look, that logic is certainly understandable, but it also eclipses the reality that there's a shortage of sand in the world, believe it or not. So it sounds great to use virgin sand, but if you're literally stealing it from beaches in the middle of the night, I feel like the glass lobby may have a perspective on the utility of recycling glass, right?
yeah, yeah,
So yeah, look, circularity and technology around it, especially for apparel, is not a done deal. It's from a very supply chain oriented perspective. Makers of recycled and sorting manufacturers have said to me, like, look, we're in the waste picking business. Like, that's how they see themselves. So they are taking waste, which is actually clothing, and they're working on the technology that makes it more sophisticated to read the composition of the material. So it's the retrieving, and that's the feedstock, right? That comes from like your t-shirt and my t-shirt and goes into this little conveyor belt. And as the sophistication of the technology increases, it can distinguish, my cotton blend from your, wool blend, and then siphon that off and take it, chemically recycle it, or there are a variety of different ways to recycle, which incidentally is covered in the Textile Exchange report. And you can make more fabric that way. Now, the economics behind that, I think we understand. We're a ways from making that common sense. However, one of the biggest factors that drives manufacturers of consumer goods is consumer preference. And while, you and I and generations before us had certain ideas, and maybe even we think they're progressive about what we're willing to pay for, the youth, sadly, I am further and further from that category every day. The youth, and I'm talking like, 18-year-olds, 16-year-olds, right? Like the real tastemakers. They are like, where the heck is my recycled fabric? They are willing to pay a little more, which matters to manufacturers. They are willing to put their values on the line and shop with their values. And so with that, like push pull, it gets to that traditional dynamic that we're all looking to kind of crack.
Good. Yeah. And that's encouraging to hear, actually, because I've certainly read my fair share of industry behavioral reports on sustainability and circular preferences from buyers, and there's often this gap between what they say they will do and what they actually will do.
Yeah.
But at least the younger generations are, in your perspective, from your experience, is actually embracing that, because perhaps they also recognize it's part of their longer term future. So,
yeah.
If what I like to do in this conversation every time is try to get to some of the meat on the bone that would be there in terms of what should companies do. When the industry members come to people like you and I to help try to figure this stuff out. Yeah. And when you're trying to grapple with this and in bringing into not just what the Textile Exchange materials talk about, but others as well that are trying to inform industry on a better way, how do you kind of try to help people get ahead of it, or get on top of it at least, and start to make an impact?
I mean, everybody comes to the conversation if they're interested. There's always the but I just don't know how, right? Like the companies know how. There is a big we have the knowledge, right? There's just a doing aspect. But to get very specific about it, I think it's on like page 14 of our report. And I really am driving this report because it really is that good. We've got a little chart that outlines what we need from brands, from investors, from retailers, from consumers. It's there, and it kind of shows you the role that needs to happen. But in big picture, the things that need to happen is that we need to stop the dependence on virgin materials. So if you're going to the store and you're buying something that is polyester or polyester blend and it isn't recycled in any way, you're essentially like taking out any environmental benefit you may have gotten by your hybrid vehicle or your electric vehicle, because you're essentially propping up the oil industry by doing that, right? Like that's just because petroleum becomes polyester. I don't know that everybody realizes that. So if you're buying like a new piece of polyester, you are essentially buying oil for your body. So think about it that way. So we need to decrease that, and we need to get, you're laughing at me, but it's true. And we need to get,
it's actually true.
it's true. Yeah. And so we need to get the apparel industry and individual brands, right? It's really easy to say the industry, but like individual brands need to be challenged to move away from those virgin materials toward feedstock that is recycled. Make it a bigger proportion of your merchandise if you're using synthetics. And for the non-synthetics, make sure you're using an increasing quantity of natural material that is sustainably produced. And again, like we've got all the tools to help you how to do that. And it's kind of known, whether it's organic or regen agri or what have you. And then we need to be able to scale up textile to textile recycling. Like it's a bit of a chicken and egg, right? And to your point about the economics of it all, it's not going to be economical until we continue to perfect the technology that goes into it, which means we need constant investment in technology that's going to make material to material recycling feasible. Now, I mentioned EU regulations in this space and how they're coming, right? They may get delayed, but maybe it may take a while, but it's coming. Like there is an incentive here to make it work. There is an economic argument for this. It's just that the technology and the complexity has not been simplified sufficiently to make it a go-to option or to produce maybe the quality of the fabric that is necessary from the recycled material. And then finally, and I mentioned this, you need to support like lower impact materials, right? Again, with the regen agri or the organic or the less carbon intensive or modern ways of farming that are not reliant on pesticides and herbicides that create all sorts of havoc into the biosphere, right? Biodiversity, water usage, land usage, all the stuff. So those are three big things that industry can be focusing its efforts on. And I think, depending on the brand, like they are, you get into difficulties around the greenwashing, which EU regulation around green claims is going to hopefully start dealing with greenwashing. There may be other effects, but nothing's perfect. So the brands know to do this. They're just taking a while. And like you said, not everybody's Patagonia, right? Shout out to Patagonia. Everybody wants that standard, and not everybody's them. So.
Yeah, well, they have the advantage of starting the company from the very premise of sustainability and everything that they did. So, and that's not a luxury most apparel brands have these days. They're dealing with decades of infrastructure and business models that are not like that. So
purposed with that vision. I learned in law school that where you end up has everything to do with where you start out. So I think your point is exactly that. They started with that mission. Other brands, they don't want to be associated with environmental destruction, but they're not necessarily trying to claim the sustainability mantle as a reason that their consumers are buying their product. And there's a lot of discussion in the sustainability space about reaching the C-suite and what's happened, blah, blah, blah. I think, we could talk about this as a whole different episode, but if your CFO is not as sustainably minded as your head of sustainability, you're constantly going to be having this discussion. We'll just leave it at that.
Yep. Understood. So, well, that takes us to probably about time. This has been very insightful and informative. I thank you for demystifying some of this stuff for us as well, in terms of the importance of circularity in apparel and textiles, and the play with regulation, the influences of regulation. For those of you out there, stay tuned for the next episode. Please hit subscribe so you don't miss an upcoming issue. And by all means, if you like the content, let us know if this is hitting home with you, and we'll provide more of it in the future. And Pamela, yes, I will hold you true. We will come up with another one that's equally pressing, and maybe a deeper dive into one of these areas for the benefit of the folks that are watching. And thanks a lot,
Tim.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
Bye.
All right, gang. See you next time. Bye-bye.